The Viking world is fascinating and mysterious and obviously fraught with inaccuracies created by Hollywood and TV shows, but they also didn't leave much written material behind them. Today's guest, Alex Harvey, is going to tell us about those Vikings he thinks we've forgotten and how he came to learn about them. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Thank you, everybody, for coming along to another episode of Future Imperfect with me, your host, Jason Kingsley. Don't forget, I've got a Modern History TV YouTube channel, should you be interested in seeing me on a horse or something like that, wearing armour or talking about swords. But anyway, I have with me somebody who we're going to have a really lovely chat with, a chap called Alex Harvey, who is interested in Vikings. Now, I'm saying that deliberately provocatively because I sort of want to know his opinion. Alex, could you introduce yourself and this book that sounds very, very fascinating?
Hello. My name is Alex Harvey and I am indeed interested in Vikings, although definitely I'm going to bite the bait there, Jason, because the term Viking in that context I don't think would have been used in the Viking Age, which is one of many mysteries that enthralls me about the period.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions sort of prepared, and then we'll just have a good old ramble about Vikings, because I am fascinated about the impact that that period of history had. Now, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the sort of Vikings come along significantly after the Romans all left this island in a period that used to be called the Dark Ages, but people prefer not to use that term now. So what do you consider to be the Viking period, the Viking kind of event? How would you describe it?
That's a great question. And that's one of the founding questions for my recently released book, Forgotten Vikings. There's been various attempts throughout history to find the beginnings and ends of various historical periods. It's very useful, of course, when teaching history at school age, is to have these different coloured blocks of time. You move away from the red Roman period into the murky green Dark Age and then into the blue Viking Age. And they start at set dates, 8th of June, 793. If we're trying to find a Viking event, that's the Lindisfarne raid. That's the most famous one. Everyone's heard of it. The word Lindisfarne, it's stapled on mugs. I even have one downstairs. But, the further you learn about any historical topic, the more minutiae you come to grips with, the more you realise how little we know. And certainly trying to find a beginning of the Viking Age is one of those back and forth mysteries. So yes, the first major recorded raid was on the 8th of June, 793 against the monastery of St. Cuthbert's on the Holy Island. But there would undoubtedly have been raids beforehand, up in Pictish territories in Scotland. Certainly in Ireland, there's some early 9th century Norwegian graves that have old Irish reliquaries in them, that have presumably been looted from seaside chapels, maybe around the same year as Lindisfarne, probably before, perhaps. There's also a few odd textual mentions. For example, a Mercian charter from the reign of King Offa, that's dated a full year before Lindisfarne, and it talks about a need to strengthen churches against roaming pagans. Alcuin of York, writing a few years after Lindisfarne, he, by this point, is just referencing pagan pirates like it's obvious, like they're so ubiquitous. So it wasn't an overnight thing. No one woke up on the 8th of June and thought, oh, thank God we've moved beyond the early medieval period and we're transitioning into the Viking Age.
Exactly. There are always these sort of very blurred transitional periods, and often very geographical, aren't they, as well? Because one part of the country might be experiencing the very first few raids of pagan pirates, and the other part of the country has never heard of it, doesn't have anything going on at all for another generation, perhaps, potentially, until it has an effect on them. I mean, I think the Lindisfarne one is particularly interesting because obviously they were literate people there, and so if you're raiding a Pictish village, nobody's going to write anything down because they weren't that literate, I believe. I'm not quite sure. You might correct me on that one.
Well, that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, Lindisfarne was obviously literate, so the people that survived are going to write about it because that's what they do. Those illustrated documents, those books, and the seriousness with which they took the written word, I think, as an art form, it's pretty obvious they're going to talk about it. And of course, the religious context, I guess, they would see it as some kind of potentially in the shape of their religion. It's some kind of punishment, and the fact they're pagan as well. Is that something that you comment on?
Definitely. The religious atmosphere is explicit in all of the immediate and indeed later mentions of the Lindisfarne raid and subsequent raids. I mean, it wasn't just raided once in kind of a single act of terrorism as it's imagined today. Lindisfarne was repeatedly harassed by, I suppose we can call them Northmen, as they did, moving beyond 793. A brilliant source to kind of shine a light, perhaps, on the religious hysteria of the time. Some of it slightly retrospective is the history of St. Cuthbert. That obtusely kind of pits St. Cuthbert, Christians, monks, and the memory of the saint against Scandinavian pagans. They're at odds with one another within the text. They're vicious nemeses. No matter where they are in the north of England, his remains are removed from Lindisfarne after a bunch of raids and their transition to Chesterley Street and County Durham. And along those journeys and in subsequent events, numerous kind of Irish/Scandinavian pagans are portrayed as essentially literary devils. It's a mixture of archetypes, stereotypes, the pop culture of the time. But your earlier point about the separation between the presence of, I suppose, Pictish monasteries and their literate culture and the golden age of Northumbria, so exuberantly shown on leaves of the Lindisfarne Gospels, like you mentioned. The Picts, they did have a very vibrant monastic culture. We have poems like the Miracles of Bishop Ninian that describe the importance of the Picts upon the kind of European religious stage. But principally, I suppose it's less about whether the victims of Viking attacks are literate themselves and more what is the geographic location of the chronicle that describes these raids. And certainly in the case of Lindisfarne, it's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was composed towards the end of the 9th century around Winchester, and then some later recensions are in slightly different locations like Worcester or Peterborough. And, you know, picture yourself as a West Saxon analyst. You hear about some stuffy Pictish monasteries up in Shetland or Orkney or Caithness that have been raided by relatively nebulous northern foes. You're probably like, yeah, okay, pull the other one. But then Lindisfarne's raided. All of a sudden, to read from the entry for the year after Lindisfarne in that same chronicle, it states all of the isles of Britain were raided. So in previous decades, scholars may have imagined that Lindisfarne and then the subsequent year is this massive explosion in raiding. In 792, Vikings didn't exist. Suddenly they do, and suddenly they're everywhere. But I like to read that entry as a little bit of retrospective correcting on behalf of the chronicler. They're like, oh no, this is actually a real deal now. Quickly, let's reference the fact it has been going on beforehand. And certainly even earlier references in the chronicle are tampered with later on. That's the thing about these texts.
So were these potential earlier raids, would we recognise them as Viking raids as such, or is there just this long tradition of people raiding from the sea and it gets sort of localised as a Viking thing? Because I mean, let's face it, the Bronze Age collapsed where they talked about the sea people raiding, you know, empires and around the Mediterranean. And so I'm wondering how much of a ubiquitous thing in history, basically people landing in boats and stealing stuff actually was, and why this is different.
That's a fantastic question. I mean, that has underpinned the last few years of Viking Age research, is what started the Viking Age. And if we can identify, sometimes using theoretical models, the sociological, economic, psychological reasons behind, let's say, the Lindisfarne raid, then what can that tell us about the period and how it evolved? Certainly, I think there's been so many models thrown at the origin of the Viking Age. Was it because there's poor farmland in Scandinavia? No, we've moved away from that now. Was it a zealous hatred against Christianity? Probably not. Maybe there's a few isolated examples, but by the by, no. The kind of underline there is, why would people in any period of history want to go out raiding and want to steal wealth, and in some cases kidnap people to sell in the slave trade? It's for money.
Yep.
And with more money comes increased reputation. We see this in the golden age of piracy in the 17th century, 18th century. You mentioned the Bronze Age, and that's a brilliant parallel there already, because in Norway at the time, we have stone carvings, and they're called petroglyphs, kind of tattooed rocks, if you like, that depict warriors on boats, armed with spears and swords. I mean, these are depictions of seamanship. They're emphasizing strength and battle prowess. These are all traits we associate with the Viking Age. Various scholars before me have coined these kind of sea warrior hoods as maritories. And that's the first time I've said the word out loud. I've written it down a few times, so I don't quite know how it's pronounced, but maritoria.
I do that. I do that as well.
Yeah.
That shows is you read more than you speak. That's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But maritories, you get them in the Bronze Age, they're in the Viking Age. It underpins the impetus, I suppose.
Now, one of the other things is that Vikings seem to sort of straddle pop culture in a very strong way. I mean, we have TV shows, which I'm sure you have an opinion on the quality of the historicity of them. They might be very entertaining, but in my experience, they're not emphasizing the history in an accurate way. They're trying to entertain people.
They're emphasising some things, certainly.
But that has a long history anyway. I mean, people entertaining with lurid stories of the past is quite Viking, actually, in a way. But how would you define, in your book, how do you define, what the Viking Age actually, does it start suddenly? Is it a fade in? How does it grow? And then how does it sort of decline as well? What changes happen? Do they start to settle and stop raiding? What's your opinion?
I think for me, it's a fade in and a fade out. It's like a long Pink Floyd song.
Right.
It can neatly segue into the song that came before it and the one afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
For me, what I try to do with my book, I mean, the title's called Forgotten Vikings, and why I picked that title was because I wanted to bring to the type of audience who loves to read history books, they might go in a Waterstones or a Toppings or an independent shop and pick one off the shelf. So these aren't kind of scholarly brain boxes, but someone who wants to know a little bit more about a topic that's been thoroughly explored in pop culture and in commercial books. And I wanted to shine a light on all the Vikings, or elements of the Viking Age that are forgotten in pop culture, and certainly the beginning and the end, I think, have for too long laid under the shadow of 793 and 1066, these cut-off points. And, I suppose most adults will realise history doesn't function like that. And it might be mentioned in books, but very rarely is the period before 793 given its due, I think, in a Viking Age book, nor is the very lengthy series of endings for the Viking Age after 1066. I mean, if we're talking about a fade out, you have to have a look at the Baltic Sea and the Irish Sea. Certainly Viking activity in both of those locations sees no allegiance whatsoever to a 1066 cut-off date. It starts before 793 and it continues up into, well, in the Baltic Sea's case, something like the late 13th, early 14th century. Imagine Vikings, to use the term, sharing the same space as classical knights and crusaders.
Yes.
It's erroneous in our brain because we're so used to these TV shows that have a certain aesthetic. Vikings, as the TV show, thoroughly entertaining. It's one of the reasons I got into the period, but it does segment people of the Viking Age. It literally strands them in this kind of pagan, misty milieu, semi-legendary landscape that couldn't possibly fit alongside other eras of history like the Romans or like I mentioned, the kind of chivalry knights and what have you. I mean, just to kind of end this rambly answer, and forgive me because all my answers to questions tend to ramble, a tax roll from the year 1212, so the reign of King John, mentions the word Viking. In Middle English, it's Wikini, and essentially it's just a reference to pirates in the Irish Sea.
So the word is synonymous with pirate, really. I mean,
yeah.
The word at that stage has become synonymous with pirates, and it's just, yeah.
Interestingly, it's always been synonymous with pirates. I mean, the earliest attestation of Viking, or cognates of that word, so the Old English equivalent, which is Viking, is an 8th century glossary, and it just means two pirates or piracy, sea rovers. There's variations like Vikingskeiðan. In the Old English translation of Exodus, the tribes of Israel are referred to as sea rovers. So it's a word that carries no ethnic connotation whatsoever. It's just a generic descriptor for anyone who's raiding, trading, travelling.
So it's not really describing Northmen coming over. The word got co-opted in some ways by that event, certainly in the British Isles, I guess. Where does the word Viking come from? Because I'm kind of interested in weird muddle that is English, because we've got lots of languages
Yeah.
sort of embedded in it. Is it a foreign word?
Well, I mean, you bang on the money with it being co-opted. We have Sir Walter Scott to thank for modern pop cultural use of the term. Where it originated is a difficult question because it has elements of Old English, like the ing at the end of the word usually means folk of or kin of. So it might be people of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
The first element, wic, might come from the Latin vicus or vicus, which means centralised point or trading site, normally associated with bays. There's also a bay in Norway called the Viken or the Vik. There's a larger region called Viken as well. So it might mean people from there, and then later it was kind of applied to everywhere else. It's difficult to say. I think normally with these mysteries of etymology, the common sense route tends to be the one I follow. So for me, I think that the origin of the term Viking starts with people of the bay, or just generally people associated with the sea.
Yeah.
Be them raiders or traders, they wouldn't have perhaps seen a distinction.
And is it true that they often did trade as well as raid? They weren't always, the Viking longships weren't always raiding. They sometimes traded and then turned around and presumably raided as well. Is there a combination of those things that they're doing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, any opportunity to make money, essentially.
Yes.
Some have said in the past that we should imagine the Vikings as the first kind of proto-capitalists of the early medieval period. I mean, yes, there are those who are just going around raiding monasteries, maybe kidnapping a few people, but they're essentially after portable wealth. Around the 10th century, there's a shift that's observable in a variety of forms of evidence, kind of coin deposits, hoards, spatial layouts of farms, that points to a shift away from portable wealth and instead genuine investment in I suppose what I call big money. So it's not just stealing someone's wallet, it's kidnapping loads of Irish monks and then investing them into the slave trade that's generating loads of Arabic silver already.
Right. So they were trading people. They'd steal them from one place and sell them to another.
Well, I mean, the sad fact is, and it's a sobering reality, is that the rivers of silver that we characterise with the Viking Age, they run atop a kind of thousands of corpses of enslaved folk, many whose names we'll never ever know. And they would have had thoroughly miserable lives. There might have been a few moments of happiness, here or there. Certainly in the sagas, there's the odd anecdote or two that implies, a few slaves had happy endings. But for the vast majority of people, absolutely miserable. You might be clubbed over the head while having a wee on a chapel in Ireland. You wake up in the bowels of a longship, or you might be viciously stolen from your mum and dad on the beaches of Morocco, and then next thing you know, you're in Dublin. There was a vast slave trade in the Roman period, and it may have ebbed somewhat between the 3rd and 5th centuries, but by the Viking Age, it's reached an absolute apogee. And that's thanks in part to a recognition. As I was saying, in the Viking Age, people, I use the term sniffing out money. I mean, these wolves, if you like, were well aware where silver was trickling in from and what Arabic, Roman, distant Greek markets wanted, and they knew how to plug gaps and generate obscene profits. And just look at Scotland, for example.
It's one of the things that people tend to shy away from with history is the human cost.
Yeah.
The fact that slavery was a big thing. And when you talk about slavery today in a podcast, you get people talking about later period of slavery, the slavery of black people by white people of various different types. But the history of slavery goes back a lot further. And, pretty much, it seems to me, most cultures from the past enslaved most other cultures if they could get away with it. And if it was worth it financially. Is that how you would see it?
Well, specialised as I am in the kind of bit between 350 and 1100, I'm always careful when applying comparative models and knowledge to other periods because I just haven't read enough about, say, the early Roman Republic to comment. But certainly I think in the bit I look at, the classic Dark Ages, slavery's, at some periods it's endemic, at other periods it's just very popular, but it's a known quantity of the world. We've got early 6th century law codes from the Merovingian world that talk about the various complicated procedures in identifying freed slaves and how to get them back on both sides of the English Channel. And, in those law codes and other documents from the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, there are references to pirates kidnapping people or raiding, not necessarily monasteries, but certainly villages or farmsteads along the coast. And Ian Wood, one of many scholars who I've read and researched over the years, he once called the period between 400 and 800 the first Viking Age because, while the textual sources don't overdo it, there are enough references to piratical activity, and there's enough archaeological evidence of boats, boat fragments, nautical armies and maritime imagery to suggest that a similar thing is going on in the centuries before the Viking Age. Maritime elites who climb the greasy social ladder via committing acts of violence to big themselves up and accrue money and wealth. And, these kind of processes occur in an abstract sense today. If you've ever been working in a kind of closed job sector or a dead man's shoes job market, you've felt the social pressures of wanting to leave and accrue wealth and fame or reputation or status outside of a closed economic network. I mean, these for me are the motives behind the Viking Age, and certainly any instance of piracy, or whether they're kidnapping people or stealing gold throughout history.
Yeah. So let's move on a little bit to the sort of material culture. I mean, one of the things that the Vikings in specific terms that we're talking about are what they wore, how they did their things, and the longships. Now, longships obviously seem to be fairly characteristic, but is that true? Are they a Viking thing as such? And were they special, or are they just boats?
It's never just a boat, my friend. No, I mean, any kind of ship from this period is a thing of beauty, whether it's clinker built with overlapping wooden planks or carvel built, where they're kind of side to side like a bucket. We have so many fragmented finds that bridge the gap between the Roman period and the Viking Age that indicate pretty substantial traditions of boat building, from Belgium to the mouth of the old Rhine to Scotland, perhaps, certainly in Scandinavia before the Viking Age. Whether these are stone carvings or bits of timber, or like Sutton Hoo's case, the outline of a boat with rusty nails, we know that longship-looking things, maybe we wouldn't call them true longships, keel boats, I suppose, would be a safe term. We know that these existed from at least 400 BCE. I think the earliest keeled boats from the Mediterranean in the east. But in the North Sea, it's slightly later, but it's certainly well before the Viking Age. What separated Scandinavian boats from the competition, if you like, was, I think, a combination of the inherent mastery of sailing, boat building, and maritime navigation that was embedded in the folk memory and culture of people who grew up along the North Way, Norway, or in the bogs of Denmark or the Great Lakes of Sweden. To live around those areas, you're around water all the time. You just have to adapt, I suppose.
Well, I was just thinking whether that comes largely from the geography, which is roads are very steep and very hard to navigate. And if you want to get anywhere, you've got to sail around the coast, and therefore sailing and boats become second nature, a bit like areas where, in the great steppes of Asia, horses become important because there aren't that many big rivers and you've got landscapes to travel, and horses do that quite well. And I wonder whether their expertise in and their perfection of their sort of shape, the beautiful sort of aesthetic nature of their longships was sort of driven by that component of the accident of geography, perhaps.
Absolutely, Jason. I mean, you bang on the money there. Geography leads history by the hand. I mean, it always has. Certainly in Scandinavia, you've got some really unique topographical environments, and they chiselled from the Nordic Bronze Age, if not earlier, peoples whose livelihoods are thoroughly bound to, movements of shoals, whales, seals, and, like you say, to get around quickly, it's rafts, it's boats, whether these are dugout canoes or much later keel longships. So it was a combination of the kind of psychology behind boat building, but also the fact that they were just absolutely great and really efficient at building boats. There's a brilliant line in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that I reference a few times in my book, where King Alfred attempted to build his own kind of navy, certainly a small fleet of boats, and they state these were built neither in the Frisian or the Danish form or variety. So the Frisians are ubiquitous early medieval sailors. They would have ping-ponged all over the North Sea. And the Danes in this context, I suppose, would probably mean Scandinavians generally. So it was thoroughly recognised at the time that the guys to the east of England were just much better at it because their lives are based around the sea.
Was there the implication there from what he said that his boats weren't as good as theirs?
Well, yeah, that's the implication I think we've picked up on now because, of course, we're looking retrospectively. This reference is the year 896.
Right, okay.
You know, I mean, and the Chronicle, like all of these annals, is a work of propaganda. It's West Saxon propaganda, and the onus would be our boats aren't like the Frisians or the Danish ones. They're in fact much better. But the fact they're not mentioned at all, really, beyond that, would tell you probably didn't see much use. I mean, the method in which Wessex and later Mercia dealt with raiders isn't meeting them out on the water. It was to, I suppose, follow a very Roman method of building centralised military strong forts on road networks that served as communal refuges so that nothing could actually be raided, and you forced the enemy into a siege. And you know one thing about Viking Age warfare, it's hit and run tactics for the most part, certainly not regularly sieging.
Yes, and if the cost of the raid is not worth the cost that you're going to get, and you don't want to hang around too much, you want to go on to the next. It's almost like making the place too expensive to raid, so they'll move on to the next place.
Yeah, exactly.
So it just sort of moves them down the coast. As far as I understand, they also used riverways quite a lot. Didn't the Vikings raid Paris at one stage?
Oh, yes, on 2 stages.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, rivers are extensions of the sea. I mean, I know it's a different quality of water, different wildlife and so on, but a great author who's always inspired me to write, Max Adams, said it best, I think. He envisions river networks and marshlands as a Viking Age tube map. So they wouldn't perhaps have access to maps like we know today, but by getting on the, say, Oused line, you'd know eventually you'd come up to York in, say, 2 days. And so marshlands are doubly important in the Viking Age networks, both economically and military-wise, because they're essentially where multiple rivers meet. They're like King's Cross Station. So where I grew up in the border of South Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, it was until roughly the mid-17th century all swamp.
Right.
And it was dotted by a few islands, and all of these islands would have just been pirate enclaves, basically, in the Viking Age. And everywhere around it would have been within the kind of predatory field, the hunting grounds, riverlands, essentially.
So it's very different than we might imagine the landscape, because sometimes you think of the Vikings just landing on the coast, running up the beach and sort of raiding the chapel that's at the top of the cliff and then running back again. But they were going away, as we would look at it, going inland a long way. They were following these rivers inland as pretty much, sounds like, almost as far as they were navigable in their boats.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It's a few years old now, but there's a raiding mechanic in that, as you'll know. And your longship picks up speed to like Mach 5 and bulldozes into the beach, and all your men jump out, and it's this sudden violent burst. I mean, place yourself on the floor, I suppose. Where does a raid begin? Is it from the moment, the axes come out, the swords come out, or is it in the information gathering stage beforehand? Multilingual people, the early medieval Scandinavians, and really anyone going about raiding, they would have been picking up on schedules. They would have known the correct day, where perhaps guards were a bit sleepy or schedules were changing over. They would have known the ins and outs of a fortified town or a monastery with walls. They would have known the best time of the year to raid, both based on weather patterns and also the political situation of the various countries they were invading. I mean, it's no surprise that as soon as there's a civil war in Carolingian France and Germany in 841, the chronicles say the Northmen arrived.
So they were following geopolitics. Go, look, we should raid there because they won't do anything. They won't be able to fight back.
Yeah, they were very clever. I mean, it's not like they were reading the Sunday Times and saw a headline that said Northumbria split in two, and they thought, right, that's where we're going on holiday. But the rate at which information would have travelled across the North Sea and beyond was really rapid. So it's an ephemeral form of evidence we can never find. But, we find silver, we find Baltic amber for other trade goods. We can't dig a layer and find a piece of information like a cheat code from the Viking Age, like a messenger saying, oh, I've heard that every Sunday this chapel leaves its treasury open. We'll never find that note because it wouldn't have been written down.
Yeah.
But certainly interpreters, translators and intel gatherers, let's perhaps call them spies, played a very important role in the act of raiding. Certainly as we move it towards the bigger targets of kind of the middle of the Viking Age, 9th, 10th century.
I wonder if they paid for information. I have this vision of somebody, a sneaky Viking landing and sort of having a clandestine meeting with somebody local, paying a few bits of silver to the local who says, oh yeah, the monks are, I don't know, they've just got a new reliquary, so you should go and nick it.
You know what? That's probably not far from the truth.
So some of the locals possibly were involved as well.
Definitely.
I also think sometimes the thing we miss in the modern world sometimes is sound and smells as well. And I know Christian churches, chapels, they often use bells to call people to worship and things like that. And I was thinking, I wonder if you're sailing in a normal environment, I wonder how far the sound of bells would travel. And you'd go, I think there's something there we could have a look at if you're just sailing down the coast. Or maybe lights in the darkness. You're sailing in the evening and you see a lit up place and you go, well, they're spending a lot of money on lighting the place up. They've probably got money to nick. I don't know.
No, I mean, that's a brilliant point. I mean, I say this in the 5th chapter of Forgotten Vikings, that try as we might to immerse ourselves in any historical period, we might spend years at a dig site, for example, or pooling through manuscripts, to actually recognise what our senses pick up today, what we smell when we go on a walk, what we can hear constantly. I've got my window open, I can hear cars in the distance. I'm nowhere near a road, but the sound travels. Imagine just removing all of that, removing your phone, removing headphones, removing any sort of knowledge that we know the Earth is spherical and what the stars are, and to try and kind of place yourself in that environment. You'd pick up on so much more. You'd read the landscape and the sky very, very differently. And like you say, sound would travel in a different way.
Yeah, well, I had an interesting experience once. I don't really remember, there was that Icelandic volcano that spewed dirt into the sky and all the planes were cancelled, all the flights were cancelled. I went for several rides during that time period and I was quite astonished at the quiet that there was. There were still roads going in the distance, but there weren't light planes going over. There was no rumble of jet engines in the high atmosphere.
Yeah.
It was remarkably silent. You'd almost hear birds in the hedges much further away than you might normally. It was actually quite remarkably noticeable. Just for a few days, it was very strong. And I would imagine it's the same kind of stuff. There's different things you would detect in a pre-industrial landscape that we probably don't even know we're missing.
Yeah.
The things, a rumble of roads, you just tune out, you don't hear it. But if it wasn't there, it would probably be really loud silence. Just to talk about the material culture again, there appears to be a lot of nonsense talked about what the Vikings wore. And the classic is Viking helmets.
Oh, yeah.
Now, as far as I'm aware, there aren't many helmets and armour from the Viking period, but maybe you can sort of help illustrate what I'm talking about here.
Well, no, you're right. There's not many at all. The classic motif of the horned helmet, which I suspect everyone was kind of mentally flashbanged with when you said helmet there, that originates from, we mentioned it earlier, the Nordic Bronze Age. So the costume designer for Wagner's Ring Cycle play, where a lot of our modern obsessions with the Viking Age originates, he based his heroic costumes of some of the characters involved on genuine archaeological finds. But these are horned helmets, in a sense, ceremonial horns, but they date like 2,000 years before the Viking Age.
Right.
Again, I mention it in the book because it's something I find quite amusing, is there's kind of 3 layers to the approach to the horned helmet. It's not really a debate, I suppose, more of an argument. When growing up as a kid, you'll probably think Vikings had horned helmets because you might have a Playmobil figure of a horned helmeted Viking. Then you'll grow up a bit, you might watch horrible histories in your teenage years and develop an interest beyond that, and you'll say confidently, Vikings definitely didn't have horned helmets. And then you get to the kind of top layers of academia, really specialised, and you find, stone carvings, people constantly with horns, and then you recognise that things like leather and wool and cloth don't often preserve. Maybe, in certain ritual contexts, there would have been caps with horn-like appendages attached to them. Whether they were used in battle is a clear no, I think, from a common sense standpoint. It just wouldn't really make sense. But in a weird dance in the middle of a glade at night, if your boss, your chieftain, puts on a woolly hat with some reindeer antlers stuck to it, part of the fun. I think that, it's not really a horned helmet, but it's certainly horns.
I think also that sort of weapons culture probably lends itself to raiding. I wear armour, 15th century plate armour and joust in it, and it's blooming heavy, and you don't want to be travelling far if you can avoid it. If your job is to make money, as we've talked about, and to raid places and steal stuff, you want to travel conveniently. You want to get in and get out. You probably don't see your job as actually having a fight if you can possibly avoid it. You're not there to deliberately pick a fight. If a fight happens, maybe you deal with it, but you want to get in and out as cost effectively as possible. And I wonder whether their equipment reflected that. Shields are kind of useful, spears, axes, swords. What do you think?
Well, I think, again, you're on the right lines, certainly. Your point about armour, I'm imagining you now talking to me sat in a full set of plate armour.
Making far too much noise, but I'm not very far away from some plate armour. But yeah, it's just I have experience of extremely heavy armour.
Yeah.
For those that are interested, my 15th century armour is half my body weight.
Wow.
It's immensely heavy, but it's designed to protect you in a cavalry context.
And you wouldn't be raiding in that. You certainly wouldn't be in waist-high water in that.
Exactly. Well, you'd just drown, wouldn't you? And go rusty too.
Well, exactly. Yes, there was armour in the Viking Age. There's numerous references to mail coats. We find a few samples archaeologically, but I suppose it would depend case by case, but certainly the bulk of raiding was done to accrue wealth. It wasn't done to go and have a scrap. I don't even think there would have been too much violence on a few raids. The violence is always implied, I think, in this period, but I like to use an analogy when I give lectures of two different forms of violence. There's real physical damage that can be done to you. Then there's implied violence. And yes, a Viking Age raid could happen if a longship showed up, everyone's killed, and then their corpses are robbed. Alternatively, imagine if you knew that could happen, and then a longship shows up, and one guy gets out and says, "Come on, guys, pay up, you know what will happen." No one's killed there, but the violence has been used as a front. So I think that speaks some ways towards the armour of the period, the weapons used, but also the mindsets. And yes, most raiding crews would have been quite happy to flee if things got a bit sketchy. Because, why bother? In 878, King Alfred, the forces of Wessex Mercia, they defeat a great summer army, a heathen raiding force, composed of Scandinavians, Frisians, a few local crooks. Literally the year later, a massive raid force appears in Belgium. And you think, are these two different armies? Or are they just the same army that's left? It's got its arse kicked in England.
Right.
Thought, sod this. It's getting too hard. Let's go over to Belgium. I heard it's easy pickings over there. Goes back to what I said earlier about the spread of information.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the human side of it is if you can raid somewhere, make some money, and it's low cost to you, it's not much effort, you're not risking anything. Even if you win a fight, you might get injured, you might get an infection, you might die in the sort of medical sophistication of the time. So why risk it? If somebody looks like they're going to put up a big fight, unless you're really motivated and they've got some really big treasure, well, just go away, come back again.
Exactly.
A few weeks later or a few months later, you use your tactics. And I think from what I understand of the sagas, the idea of sophisticated strategies was perfectly acceptable. You don't just have to have a stand-up fight. If you can gain something by sneaky means, that was as admirable, perhaps. Or am I misunderstanding their culture?
No, I think you're very bang on. Cunning and skill, being a wordsmith and a big thinker. These are positive tropes for characters in the sagas. To what degree the sagas written for the most part from the 13th century onwards, reflect genuine attitudes in the Viking Age? I mean, that's the eternal question. We could hypothesize a few bits and pieces in them, certainly do apply. I think the attitudes towards traits, violence, cunning, word skill, whatever, transmuted they may have been, but certainly they're probably fairly accurate to the Viking Age. I think I tend to avoid using sagas to identify specific people. I've just finished reading a saga, one of my favourites, Gisli's Saga. It's an amazing yarn about, they're all about blood feuds, but this is about a particular blood feud that ends with a bloke diving off a cliff with his guts hanging out, and he drives a sword straight through the head of one of his attackers and kills himself instantly in the process. And, strewn throughout this 70-page epic are all these bouts of violence. Some of them are too ridiculous to believe. Others are a character dressing themselves as a slave so that they can slip past their pursuers and they get someone else killed. At one point, Gisli pretends to have what we would today understand as severe mental ailments so that they think he's a troll. And again, to avoid danger. And, throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, maybe these things happened. Perhaps multiple people did some of them. One person may have pretended to be a troll, another person fell off a cliff and his guts came out and killed someone on the way down. And these feats would have been remembered, and they've gone through 200, 300 years of translation by this point, and they've crystallized into one narrative. But what we're only seeing is, I suppose, one mosquito trapped in amber out of about 10 that are flitting in all sorts of directions. It's the same, not just with sagas, but any kind of weird heroic poetry from early medieval Wales, for example. We just see one version of it that's translated and we can buy in shops.
Yeah, we have so little, don't we? We have such a tiny sliver of the past to try to sort of examine. Sometimes you've got one source for something, and it seems perfectly kind of legit, but one source is weak in a way, but it's all we've got to go on unless this can find material culture. Coins and things, but how representative are they? That's what I find is great about history. And I keep coming back to the human side of it. The one thing that doesn't change very much is that humans are quite tricky. We're quite clever. We come up with solutions to things. We might not get our stories written about, but we kind of want to be well thought of by our peer group. And I imagine the Vikings were exactly the same. They're us, really, just in a different historical context. Coming to the end now, and it's been absolutely fascinating, but was there anything significant I've missed out that you want to sort of tell people about your book or about this particular period in history?
I think for me, and I've really enjoyed yapping about this topic, so thanks very much for facilitating it. I think a takeaway about my book in particular is that there are obviously so many books on the Vikings now. There are academic tomes, there are more commercial-oriented ones. What I wanted to do with mine was, there's 10 chapters, and with each one I wanted at least one kind of major fact or theory or piece of evidence that has slipped under the radar of 99% of the readership. So for one example, it would be possible written references to Vikings in Spain the same year as the Lindisfarne raid.
Oh, that's interesting. As far south as Spain?
Yeah, well, it's a tricky source to unpick, but certainly if we follow the meanings of certain Arabic words in the specific context and how it's referencing a kind of skirmish between the Arab advance, the Umayyads, and the Basque people, it seems there's a third party involved that's described using the term Majus, which is exactly the same word used in later sources to describe Scandinavians in Spain. Now, in the East, it's used to describe Zoroastrians, so it's not clear-cut, but that's the kind of point. I wanted to highlight that because I found it really interesting reading about that via primary and secondary sources.
Oh, tiny little fragments.
Yeah, and it's up to people to debate them, and if it opens questions, that's my job done, I think.
But there might be a huge story there that we know nothing about, apart from this one tiny reference, which could be interpreted in different ways. Now, that's fascinating. Gives you a whole thread to try and follow.
Oh, yeah, many threads, like a tapestry that the Norns have weaved, I suppose, to coin a phrase. A single line, a single mice bone in Madeira. These are the kind of mysteries my book unravels.
Wonderful. Well, look, Alex, thank you very much. If people want to follow you on social media, or your book is called Forgotten Vikings, New Approaches to the Viking Age, if my notes are correct.
That is correct.
Good. And where is it available? Is it available from anywhere you can buy good books?
It is available from all the usual wholesalers and retailers. It's currently, at the time of speaking, undergoing a second print run.
Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
That puts you in the minority of authors. Wonderful. And what about social media? Do you have a social media channels or anything where people can follow you if they're interested?
Yes, my main outlet for updates about Forgotten Vikings and all manner of upcoming books, I just can't help myself, is Blue Sky. And you can find me there either by searching my name, Alex Harvey, or Alex, HARVV, at Blue Sky.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's been lovely. I wish we could spend a little longer talking, and maybe when you do another book, we can have another chat about it. But
oh, definitely.
Vikings, well, what a wonderful, interesting period in history. And also for us today, it's so layered, TV shows, movies, all sorts of nonsense, but all sorts of other underlying truths as well to try and disentangle sometimes.
The nonsense encourages the untangling. I mean, I distinctly remember I was 14 and I kept hearing the same song play on the TV from downstairs. It turns out it was the theme tune for Vikings.
Right.
My dad was watching it and I saw one clip and I thought, this looks great. And I've watched the whole thing, I think twice now. And that's what propelled me to study it seriously at A-level and then university and masters to where I am today. And that's the beauty of shows like that, I think.
Exactly. And they need to be supported by us, but also not taken to be the truth necessarily.
Exactly.
They're a starting point for people.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.